I love covering Alireza Firouzja games because he's so aggressive and thrives in these complex tactical positions, and this game is a great example of that, played against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. This was in the 2021 Aim Chess US Rapid, so it was an online rapid event. Let's see what happened here. Firouzja had white, Vachier-Lagrave had black, and we saw a Grunfeld on the board. So these were the standard opening moves, and Maxime is a leading expert in this field. He loves playing the Grunfeld, so what did Firouzja have in mind? Well, after these moves here, knight f3, bishop g7, pawn h4 was played by Firouzja. Really aggressive. Would we get anything less? So when you're being attacked on the flank, it's very standard to try and counterplay in the centre, so Maxime takes this pawn on c4 here. Firouzja now goes e4, setting up the big centre, preparing to recapture here, and now there's different ways to play. Maxime goes pawn c5 here, and you don't want to capture this one on c4 immediately. Let black take here. You'd rather keep the centre closed if you can and attack on the king side here. So pawn d5 played. And now pawn b5 comes from Maxime. A really interesting idea. You're threatening to now play pawn b4. That would kick this knight, and then you can pick up on e4 here. You're also holding this one for the time being. So how does Firouzja respond? Well, he goes pawn h5, and it's a really nice way to refute b4, because now if black plays like that, you go pawn h6, and you're making this bishop look really silly after it retreats to f8. Although the knight would have to move, you lose the pawn here. White's actually doing really well after the bishop recaptures. You've got tons of compensation for the pawn. Black's going to have a hard time getting the king to safety. So that's why we didn't have this move pawn b4. After h5, here Maxime took that pawn with his knight. But he is now opening the h-file for Firouzja's rook. That could get dangerous later on. And now that the knight has left the attack of e4, Firouzja snaps off on b5. Castles was played by black. We had bishop takes on c4, and now the bishop came to g4. So the queen now came to c2. It steps out of this pin and also defends this b2 pawn, preparing to then develop the bishop and defend this pawn from the g7 bishop. And now Maxime had a couple of options of how to play. One standard way to play is take on f3, and after the pawn recaptures, although you've given up the bishop pair, you get some good dark square control here. So we could have had a6, the knight drops back, queen d6, and after bishop e3, knight d7, we can see black's getting lots of play on the dark squares. White's still better, but okay, it's an interesting way for black to go. Instead of this, Maxime goes for some piece play here. So he prefers to develop his knight to a6. I should say he doesn't go to d7, or knight h2 is powerful. You hit this bishop, it's got no retreat. You force an ugly move like knight e5, not good for black. Bishop e2 is coming soon, not what you want. So this is why Maxime goes to a6 with his knight here. And after this move of bishop to e3, he's preparing to come to c7 soon, challenge this strong knight. But first he goes rook b8, pressuring some more. And now knight c3 would have been a nice move from Firouzja, a prophylactic move. Now if knight c7, you lose this pawn, although this is the computer's preferred line, then going for counterplay down the c-file. But okay, we didn't have this. Instead of retreating that knight immediately, Firouzja went queen to d2, lining up this battery here. Classic Firouzja. He wants to exchange bishops, checkmate the black king if possible. But now knight c7 comes, so Maxime gets that move in. You can't take this pawn here now, or you're simply losing a piece on b5, of course. So we didn't have that move. We had the knight retreating here instead. And this is really elite level grandmaster play. When you have the space in the center, you don't want to swap pieces if you can avoid it. Conversely, if you don't have space, you try and swap pieces. So by coming back here, you're trying to make this knight look silly, and that's why knight e8 was immediately played. It had no jumps from c7. Maxime's rerouting it into d6. And this sets a trap, so you don't want to take this pawn on c5 now, or queen c7 comes, and you're actually losing one of these bishops. Or if you go pawn b4 to defend it, then there's this really nice exchange sack, rook takes on b4 rather. After the bishop recaptures, queen chops here, and you can see black is getting tons of play for that exchange. Black is better here. So we didn't have this move played of bishop takes on c5. Instead, Firouzja goes for this really aggressive bishop to h6 move. Now he's banking on the fact that after the bishop takes here, queen recaptures. Although black can chop off this knight, that's important so it doesn't come to g5. And after pawn recaptures, win a pawn here. What he was probably banking on was that he could chop this knight here, the pawn recaptures, and then you can even castle queenside. You hit the rook, you prepare to bring this one to the g file, looks really scary, and this is perhaps why MVL rejected this line as well. But there's this lovely move, rook b6, retreating to the 6th rank, hitting the queen, preparing to come to g6 defending, and black's actually doing fine here. The computer gives it a couple of pawns better. But okay, this is rapid chess, you can't work all of it out from a distance. So instead of taking that bishop on h6, here MVL took the pawn on b2 immediately. Still looks good, a really nice exchange sack going for the dark squares. But after queen recaptures, bishop takes here, what he had missed was this knight to e5 move. And now it's coming back to bite him that he never traded that knight sooner. So the bishop was hit, moved back to d7 here in order to cover this c6 square. And now Firouzja just swings this bishop back to e2, pressuring the knight. And the big problem for black is that you'd like to go, say, this knight back here, but then you drop your bishop. So the bishop dropped back to g7, and now the knight took here on d7. It's important you don't let black take here. So we had chops here first, after the queen took back, then Firouzja took here. The pawn recaptured, and now you don't want to dive in and take this one with your rook. You'd rather your queen gets there if you possibly can. So first we had rook c1, holding the knight here from the bishop. Now the queen came to g4, and although in the one hand it stops the queen coming to e2, Firouzja played it anyway. He's happy with the queen exchange here. He is after all an exchange up now. Now you can take on g2 here, but then the queen takes on h5. You're still attacking. If knight f6, you can drop to h2, again offer the exchange. White's doing well, being the exchange up. So we didn't have takes on g2. Maxime dropped back here, hitting this unprotected rook. And now I love this next move, queen e3. And it really reminded me of a famous Botvinnik game that he played in 1931. I looked it up before this game, where he gives black this opportunity to swap the queens, which is what Maxime did. The pawn recaptured, and although you've ruined the pawn structure, you've traded off the active black queen. In that game it was sat on c5. I'll link the game down below if you want to flick through afterwards. And now Maxime should go knight to d6, just carry on with that plan, bring it back into the game, but instead he plays this move bishop e5. I can see the logic because after the rook captures here, he goes f6. So he cements it in the centre. It's now outside this pawn chain, of course, once the f6 move is played. But the problem here is now Firouzja achieves knight a4, and after knight d6, knight takes on c5. You didn't have time for that manoeuvre. If the knight was already on d6, then it would have chopped on e4. So the rook now came to c8, the king came to d1, protecting the rook behind. We had bishop b2, rook c2 here. The bishop dropped back to a3, knight e6 was played, this pair of rooks came off, and after the knight takes on e4 here, which is what was played, rook h4 from Firouzja, here Maxime actually resigned, or possibly lost on time, I'm not sure, but this was the final move of the game. And it wasn't premature here because the rook is always going to beat out the minor piece in such positions, especially with the pawns being so weak in 3 islands. Rook g4 could come, for example, after knight c5, say king f7, you're already winning a pawn like this, and that would be the story of the rest of the game. If you enjoyed this video, then click here to see another amazing Firouzja game. Thanks for watching, see you soon.